Illusion of Gaia is an action RPG for the Super Nintendo that stars one of the many red-haired protagonist characters that set upon a path to become a hero. The game's setting is a fusion of fantasy, folklore, and real-world locations, and like any typical action RPG, you'll find yourself traveling between towns and battling enemies on your journey. You play as Will, a boy who was the lone escapee of a failed expedition to the Tower of Babel. Among those lost was Will's father, which leaves Will orphaned and in the care of his grandparents in the quiet town of South Cape. As you might have come to expect from RPGs of this generation, there are suddenly monsters lurking just outside of town and strange happenings across the lands due to a celestial force, which in this case is known as the Chaos Comet. Will eventually sets out on an adventure to find the 6 mystic statues and to discover what happened to his father. No adventure story would be complete without side characters, and Illusion of Gaia has plenty of them. Traveling companions in longer games can be hit or miss, and here unfortunately, they're definitely more on the miss side. The characters in this game are one of its weakest points in my opinion, since none of them besides from Will are even remotely likable. They don't contribute anything to the game beyond fruitless conversation and a means to move the plot forward through their actions, and their motivations are usually pretty selfish. Will's childhood friends from South Cape are Eric, Seth, and Lance, and we meet them right at the beginning of the game in their after-school hideout. There's clearly camaraderie between them all, but it seems to get lost as the story moves on past the first part of the game. Eric's always whining about mundane things like not knowing where the bathroom is, while Lance is focused on romance despite the terrible life and death circumstances that the group members are often facing. Seth probably has the most promising foundation to become an interesting character, but he disappears a short time into the journey and we don't hear from him much after that. Lily and Kara are 2 other characters introduced near the beginning of the story, and I couldn't bring myself to like either of them. The game pushes a bit of a love triangle with them and Will in the early stages, and neither girl's anyone that I'd be friends with in real life, nor anyone I'd want to see a friend end up with romantically. Lily's mean and bossy, while Kara's naive and entitled, and their manufactured drama gets old pretty quick. I couldn't help but wishing them and the rest of the cast away so that I could just play the game and focus on Will's journey. A lot of the conflict that arises from these characters is inconsequential, and much of it could be summed up by a character asserting themselves in a childish way, wandering off, and leaving the player to clean up the mess that they make. After seeing everyone introduced at the beginning, I was hoping for an epic quest with friends adventuring and developing together through their hardships, but that didn't happen at all. There was very little character development here beyond the main protagonist, and apart from a few touching moments here and there, a lot of the conversation between the characters fell flat. Illusion of Gaia's plot focuses on Will's coming of age and personal growth, so at the very least, the immaturity of the other group members was a great baseline to measure Will's character development against. Throughout Will's quest around the world, there are battle areas to venture through that usually end with finding a mystic statue. Fighting enemies is pretty instinctive when all you need to do is bludgeon things with your flute or your sword, and it was definitely one of the smoother combat interfaces I've played through. In melee combat, the hit detection was spot on, Will's movements were fast and predictable, and most of all, the variety of enemies in each new area kept combat feeling fresh and new. Unlike mindlessly mashing the attack command in games with menu-based combat, landing blows and blocking in real time made victories feel earned. Part of Will's character abilities include being able to harness dark power and take on 2 other physical forms with different attributes. The first form is Friedan the Dark Knight, and he's superior to Will in literally every way from attack range to offensive power. My only gripe is that I couldn't play as him when I wanted to, which if I'm being completely honest, probably would have been the entire time. As the game went on and I gained access to special attacks like Will's Spin Dash or Friedan's Dark Friar, I didn't really use them often in regular combat, even though the game suggested that I should be doing that. Each of the special moves requires charging up, and this wait time was often a huge disadvantage that resulted in me getting hit. Except in very rare circumstances, I usually went in swinging with my sword or flute and hoped for the best, and that usually seemed to work out alright. By the time you get to use Will's second form as Shadow, the game's practically over. Shadow's only mildly stronger than Friedan, but that's about the only benefit until the literal last encounter of the game. I wish that they'd introduced Shadow earlier, or at least let you play out the game as Friedan after spending so much time rounding out his special move repertoire by endgame. Apart from their differences in combat, Will's different forms as Friedan and Shadow serve in some puzzle-solving elements, like targeting distance switches or liquefying to reach different areas. Although the game requires you to transform into the different dark entities to move forward, unfortunately some of the moves were terrible to use and felt really broken. In particular, Will's spin dash skill, which is required to go up ramps, was incredibly difficult to execute consistently and made progressing through many areas, but especially the pyramid, really excruciating. I understand that puzzles are an important component of the game's formula, but did we really need a move to specifically go up a ramp? Could we not have just instead done away with the spin dash and let Friedan or Shadow be able to run up a slight incline? Friedan and Shadow, the all-powerful beings that transcend time and space, can decimate enemies with cool projectile attacks and change physical forms, but they can't walk up a hill. It seemed pretty silly to have to change to Will just to use his superior hill-conquering abilities. The growth and progression of Will's strength and abilities in Illusion of Gaia is pretty unique compared to other action RPGs that I've played. Increases to your life bar, strength, and defense stats are granted directly from clearing an area of all enemies rather than leveling by accumulating experience points on a per enemy killed basis. Once you've received a stat increase from a specific area, you can't get it again, so there's no point in grinding. In fact, many enemies don't respawn after you've killed them unless you lose all of your lives or leave an area completely. This can be viewed as both a blessing and a curse because although you won't have to fight the same enemy 50 times while trying to figure out where to go next, you also can't farm a specific batch of enemies to become overpowered to make bosses and enemy encounters easier. This levels the playing field for all players and puts everyone at approximately the same advantage fighting through the various areas and bosses whether they like it or not. All boss fights rely on a certain amount of skill and pattern memorization rather than strategy, and not being able to grind forces trial and error to succeed in these situations. Though some boss fights were just awful to get through, like those vampires that I could just rant all day long about, others were extremely easy and made the game feel unbalanced at times. You might be wondering why in-battle healing isn't an option here. It is, but healing items in Illusion of Gaia are extremely limited. Although they exist, herbs are not able to be purchased like healing potions are in other games. They can only be given to you or be discovered in chests as a reward for exploring. A first-time player might inadvertently use up all their herbs that they have only to find themselves without a means to heal up later in harder battles. I didn't run into this problem myself since I hoard every healing inventory item until the very end of most games, but I can only imagine the frustration of a new player that maybe didn't know that this was the case. Obviously, gaining defense and strength are good motivators to find and defeat all the enemies in the game's different areas, but I also love that you were rewarded for exploring. Red jewels were often scattered around in hard-to-reach areas, and accumulating them provided a number of benefits, like getting one of only several healing items or boosting Will's various dark powers or defense. Unlike other games that eventually allow you to return to places that you've previously visited, Illusion of Gaia doesn't. Very little backtracking is allowed, which makes the game quite linear, but with so many open-world adventures out there, it's a welcome thing. The one-way nature of the game's progression forces you as the player to leave no stone unturned before you head off to the next place if you want to find everything. In a first playthrough, unless you're using a guide, it's highly unlikely that you'll find all 50 red jewels. I capped out around 35 of them in my first time through, and I can't see myself ever getting all 50 since some of them can only be obtained in a really awful way, like returning a runaway child slave back to his labor traders. Does that sound shocking to you? If it does, you're probably not the only one that feels that way. Let's talk a little bit now about the heavy-handed plot points. There are spoilers ahoy. Now, I didn't exactly have the pleasure of playing this game in my childhood, so I went in with zero nostalgia for the game and its characters. I've noticed that Illusion of Gaia tackles a lot of heavy subjects like abandonment, starvation, suicide, child slave labor, cannibalism, and the idea of hopelessness from living in a dying world. Lots of games from this era tackled some pretty serious topics like the effects of war and loss, but Illusion of Gaia wanting to do it all and then some makes it the plot's major downfall. I can imagine that a lot of these darker things would have gone over kids' heads back in the 90s, but playing this game for the first time as an adult was pretty jarring. A few examples of this are seeing the children of a dead explorer hopefully awaiting his return, seeing our pig friend Hamlet die for us by throwing his body onto a fire so that we wouldn't be eaten by cannibals, and watching a terminally ill man take his own life in Russian glass. Most of all, a common thread throughout the majority of this game dealt with the buying and selling of children to run labor camps and to push the rich to even higher levels of wealth while the poor struggled to survive. This all sounds very compelling and interesting, but these topics were explored at a very superficial level for the most part. The game's formula ran something like this. A terrible thing would happen, we'd resolve it, the happy town music would start playing, and the game would blast us off to a new area. It was akin to the worst kind of emotional whiplash I've personally experienced in a video game. There was no noticeable, long-lasting effect on any of the characters either, and a lot of the topics were never revisited later on. To me, this was hugely disappointing. The game went through so much trouble to establish a setting with some serious themes, but tried to juggle too many things at once, giving the game a lack of focus. The characters never seemed to cope or grieve very much considering what they were enduring, and remained mostly unchanged personality-wise. Much of what I feel was missing might have been due to some of the emotion or meaning being lost in translation, but in my own experience, all I kept saying throughout my playthrough as we were shot from topic to topic was, "Aren't we going to talk about this?" So much more character development and plot depth could have been achieved if more attention had been paid to even one of these many topics, and the game really missed the mark here from my perspective. The story itself was really convoluted by the end of the game, and I was pretty confused about what exactly had transpired by the time the credits rolled. The premise initially seemed simple enough. Find the 6 mystic statues, maybe find your father, and stop a comet from destroying the world, right? Well, apparently it's quite a bit more involved than that. Will's connection with Kara actually runs much deeper than my initial thoughts of her and Will being siblings, and there's some interesting plot twists towards the end that are completely unexpected. I don't want to spoil too much about how everything comes together, but I still have a lot of unanswered questions about loose ends that never got tied up by the end, which may again just be a symptom of a shoddy translation. I've heard that some of the themes from Illusion of Gaia are explored further in Terranigma, so it's possible that things will make more sense after I play that one. With the uninteresting characters and rushing between topics, I really didn't find the story gripping or very compelling, but it was a nice diversion from the usual rebellion fighters trying to stop a war. Even with its uniqueness though, I was wishing for more exposition to set everything right when the game came to a close, and I still don't feel completely satisfied coming out of this one. Even though Illusion of Gaia has its flaws, it's a refreshing break from the turn-based tedium that had its claws in much of the 16-bit RPG generation, but with fairly weak characters and a story with more holes than a golf course with a gopher problem, I can't bring myself to say that I loved this one. I know that many people consider Gaia to be one of the best RPGs on the SNES, and maybe I just don't feel that way because I never played the game as a kid. I feel like many of the game's settings were interesting and fun to explore, and that the combat felt really great, but the intense shock value and the emotional whiplash that followed from rushing between serious topics left most of the game feeling too superficial to personally connect with. Will's journey to the Tower of Babel could have been so much more, with a tight-knit supporting cast of characters behind him as well as a cohesive translation, but for what it turned out to be, Gaia certainly isn't a bad game. It's just not one of my personal favorites. Illusion of Gaia was a nice stop on my own adventure through the 16-bit RPG generation. I definitely recommend it to people looking for a fun action RPG, but I'm looking forward to a grander story with a more compelling narrative in the games I'm playing going forward.